I accidentally cuddled my untouchable billionaire boss. Silly story begins. Please like and subscribe. Chapter 1, The Untouchable Boss. People say, I have a gift for handling difficult bosses. Personally, I think it's less of a gift and more of a survival skill. When you've worked for a CEO who made you sort his Skittles by color before every meeting, you learn to adapt. So when I got the job as Ethan Sterling's personal assistant, I wasn't worried. Sure, he had a reputation, cold, demanding, impossible to please, but that didn't scare me. I was calm, professional, and organized to a fault. There wasn't a boss in the world I couldn't manage. At least, that's what I thought. The first time I stepped into Ethan Sterling's office, I knew this wasn't going to be like any job I'd had before. The space was sleek and modern, white walls, black furniture. Not a single unnecessary object in sight. It felt almost clinical, as if someone had taken the concept of an office and stripped it down to its bare bones. It wasn't just tidy, it was controlled. And then there was him. Ethan Sterling sat behind an enormous glass desk, watching me like I was a puzzle he had already solved. He was sharp angles and cold precision, from his perfectly tailored suit to the way he held his pen, steady, deliberate, like even the smallest movement had been calculated in advance. His ice blue eyes locked onto mine, assessing, searching for something. Miss Miller, he said smoothly, let's establish one thing right away. I don't do small talk. I don't do inefficiency, and most importantly, I don't do physical contact. Understood? I nodded. Understood. No touching. It was a strange rule, but I wasn't about to argue. If anything, it made my job easier. I wasn't exactly in the habit of hugging my bosses. Good, he said, watching me a second longer than necessary. Then we won't have a problem. I gave him my most professional smile, but something about the way he held himself, like the air around him was too close, like he was bracing for something I couldn't see, made me pause. Most people who avoided touch did it out of preference, but with him it felt deeper, like a wound. Not my business. I was here to do a job, and besides, how hard could it be? I was about to find out. Chapter 2, The Incident. There are moments in life when you wake up and immediately know you've made a huge mistake. This was one of those moments. I've been a sleepwalker for as long as I can remember. When I was a kid, my mom had to put bells on my bedroom door so she could hear when I wandered out. In college, my roommate once found me curled up in the bathtub, hugging a shampoo bottle like it was a long-lost lover. At this point, I had accepted it as just another quirk of mine. Annoying but harmless. At least, it used to be harmless. That night, I had gone to bed like normal, wrapped around my favorite body pillow, letting the soft cotton soothe me into sleep. The next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by the sound of someone screaming my name. Josie! My heart nearly exploded out of my chest. My brain scrambled to make sense of my surroundings, except these weren't my surroundings. The bed was too big, the sheets too expensive, and the very angry man glaring at me was most definitely not my body pillow. It was Ethan Sterling. Whoa! Oh no! Panic surged through me as I took in the situation. I was in his bed. Not just in it, on him. One of my legs was draped over his, my arm thrown across his chest like I had every right to be there. And worst of all, my hand was still on his arm, gently stroking his skin like I was soothing a skittish kitten. I let out a blood-curdling scream, and scrambled backward so fast I nearly fell off the bed. Ethan shot up too, his normally composed face completely wrecked with shock, disgust, and, was that panic? What the hell are you doing? He demanded, his voice hoarse, like he'd just woken up from the deepest sleep of his life. I had no answer. My brain was still buffering. I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? His voice climbed an octave, as if the situation wasn't already bad enough. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to think. What was the last thing I remembered? I had gone to sleep in my room. I had curled up with my body pillow, like I always did. And then, whoa! Realization dawned like a slow-motion train wreck. I had mistaken Ethan Sterling for my body pillow. Kill me. Just kill me now. I was, sleepwalking. I croaked, barely able to get the words out. I must have wandered in here by accident. His eyes widened, as if that somehow made things worse. By accident? Josie, you were cuddling me. I groaned, burying my face in my hands. I know. I didn't mean to. I thought you were my pillow. Silence. Dead, horrible, suffocating silence. When I dared to peek at him through my fingers, he looked completely stunned. Not angry, not disgusted, just stunned. I expected him to start yelling again, or worse, to fire me on the spot, but instead, he ran a hand through his already mussed hair, looking utterly bewildered. You. He exhaled sharply, as if struggling to find words. You touched me. I gulped. Yes? His hair was a mess. His shirt slightly wrinkled. His face softer than I had ever seen it. The man looked rested. I wasn't sure what to do with that information. Neither, it seemed, was Ethan. We stared at each other, trapped in some kind of post-cuddle standoff. My face burned hotter with each passing second. Finally, I scrambled off the bed, nearly tripping over my own feet in my rush to get away. I am so sorry, I blurted. I swear, this will never happen again. I'll lock my door. I'll tie myself to the bed. I don't know, install laser tripwires. He just stared at me, like I had just solved some impossible equation, and he didn't know whether to be impressed or terrified. After what felt like an eternity, he exhaled, pressing his fingers to his temple. Go. Back. To your room. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted out of there so fast. I probably set a new world record. Chapter 3, The Aftermath. I was going to have to change my name and move to another country. It was the only logical solution. I had spent the entire night tossing and turning, reliving the horrifying, career-ending, soul-crushing moment when I had woken up in Ethan Sterling's bed. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his stunned expression. Every time I tried to calm down, I heard his voice in my head, deep, accusing, completely bewildered. You touched me. What made me feel something other than sheer, paralyzing mortification. Still, I knew what I had to do. I had to quit. I couldn't walk into his office after this and pretend everything was normal. I couldn't sit across from him in meetings without remembering the way his breathing had been slow and steady under my hand, or the way he had relaxed against me, like I was some kind of human melatonin gummy. Nope. Couldn't do it? So, I did the only thing I could. I marched to his office, resignation letter in hand, and prepared to do the most humiliating thing imaginable. Explain to my boss why I could no longer work for him because I cuddled him in my sleep. Ethan was already at his desk when I walked in, looking completely unaffected. No sign of last night's chaos. His suit was impeccable, his hair neatly styled, his expression as unreadable as ever. If I hadn't been there, I would have thought I imagined the whole thing. But I had been there, and so had he. My voice cracked. Great start. He looked up from his laptop, raising a brow. Yes? I took a deep breath, clutching the letter like a lifeline. I just wanted to say I'm really sorry for last night. I don't know how it happened, but I promise it won't happen again, ever. And I understand if you want me to. I'm not firing you. He cut in. I blinked. What? He leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. You didn't do it on purpose. It was an accident. I slept in your bed? Unintentionally. I cuddled you? Silence. A flicker of something crossed his face, something I couldn't quite place. He cleared his throat. Yes, well, we'll both move past it? I stared at him, thrown. I had prepared for a lot of things. For him to yell. For him to fire me. For him to hand me a legal document stating I was never to be within 10 feet of him again. But this casual dismissal? Something wasn't right. I squinted at him, suspicious. Are you feeling okay? I'm fine, he said a little too quickly. You're fine? I repeated, skeptical. Because I distinctly remember you having a no-touching rule. A rule I violated. Shouldn't you be? I gestured vaguely. I don't know, throwing this desk across the room? He exhaled slowly, like he was debating something. I'll admit, last night was unexpected. Understatement of the century. But, he continued, his gaze locking onto mine, I need to understand what happened. I frowned. What do you mean? He hesitated, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk. No one has ever touched me without it hurting. His voice was quieter now, more controlled. Not since I was a child. I assumed it was something I would have to live with forever. I swallowed. But you? He trailed off, jaw tightening. For some reason, your touch didn't cause pain. It did the opposite. I stared at him, completely at a loss. I had been expecting anything but this. Ethan Sterling, the untouchable, unreachable billionaire, was sitting in front of me, looking almost human for the first time since I met him. And the worst part, I understood his fascination, because I had felt it too. For a brief, impossible moment I had soothed him, and in some strange, unexplainable way, he had soothed me back. So, I said slowly, what happens now? He straightened, all traces of vulnerability vanishing in an instant. Now we continue as usual. I blinked. That's it? Yes. I narrowed my eyes. He was lying. There was no way a man as obsessive and controlled as Ethan Sterling was just moving on from something like this. I knew him well enough to know he wasn't the type to let a mystery go unsolved. And this, whatever had happened between us, was a mystery he was determined to figure out, which meant one thing. Ethan Sterling had just declared war, and I was the battlefield. Chapter 4, The Pursuit of Contact. Something weird was going on with Ethan Sterling. And that was saying something, considering the man was already the poster child for high-maintenance billionaire eccentricity. It started subtly, or at least tried to be subtle. Josie, Ethan called from his desk one morning, barely looking up from his laptop. I need you to take notes. I grabbed my tablet and moved to my usual seat across the room. Of course, not from over there, he interrupted. I paused mid-step. Sorry, he gestured toward the sleek leather couch against the wall. Sit there. Closer. I frowned. Closer? Why? I always sat at the conference table, when taking notes. It was our unspoken routine. Still, I wasn't paid to argue, so I shrugged and moved to the couch, settling in and waiting for further instruction. Then, he sighed. Closer. Okay. That was weird. I glanced at him warily. Closer how? He gestured vaguely. Just within arm's reach. Arm's reach? Why would I need to be within arm's reach? But again, not paid to argue. So with an internal shrug, I scooted over a few inches. Good? He didn't respond right away, just flicked his gaze over me, assessing, calculating, before finally giving a short nod. Good. I should have known then, but I didn't. Because the next week, things escalated. We have a business trip coming up, Ethan announced one morning. I nodded, already pulling up our travel schedule. Right. I'll book the usual arrangements. Actually, he said smoothly, I require a travel assistant this time. I blinked. You've never needed one before? Well, now I do. I hesitated, feeling like I was missing something. Okay, where would I be staying? With me? I choked on air. I'm sorry, what? You'll have to share my suite, he said casually, as if he hadn't just dropped a bombshell. For work purposes. I stared at him. What work purposes require me to share a suite with you? Ethan didn't even blink. Logistics. Logistics. Right. Totally normal. I must have been making a face because he sighed. You would have your own room within the suite, obviously. Obviously. I narrowed my eyes. Is this because of the incident? His expression remained perfectly neutral. No. Liar. But I had no real reason to say no, and honestly, I had seen worse billionaire demands in my career. So, I sighed. Fine. I should have known then too. But again, I didn't. The final clue came a few days later, when Ethan casually suggested I start staying at his penthouse. You should stay over, he said one evening as I gathered my things to leave. I froze. Excuse me? He looked far too composed for someone making an insane request. It's a matter of preparedness. Preparedness for what? He exhaled like this was all very reasonable. Another potential sleep-related emergency. I stared at him. You mean in case I sleepwalk into your bed again? His lips pressed together. If that were to happen, it would be beneficial for you to already be here. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Ethan, I am not on call for middle-of-the-night cuddle emergencies. I'm simply thinking ahead, he said, infuriatingly calm. As you should be too. Was he serious? Was this some kind of billionaire logic I wasn't capable of understanding? I rubbed my temples. Do you even hear yourself? I cannot live at your penthouse for the off chance that I sleepwalk into your room again. He shrugged. It would be convenient. Oh my God. I had no idea what was going on in his head. None. And the worst part, I don't think he did either. Because for all his carefully calculated reasoning, I was starting to notice something else about him. Ethan Sterling, my untouchable boss, was slowly unraveling. And I had a feeling I was the reason why. Chapter 5. Josie dates someone else, and Ethan has a meltdown. I hadn't intended to date anyone. Between work and, accidentally cuddling my billionaire boss in my sleep, I had enough on my plate. But then Sarah, my best friend, had given me the look. The one that said, Josie, you need to get out of your weird work bubble and interact with normal humans. And honestly, she wasn't wrong. So, I let her set me up with a perfectly normal guy named Jason. He was a teacher, sweet, funny, and most importantly, not my emotionally repressed, touch-avoidant boss. I had no idea I was about to send Ethan into a full-blown existential crisis. It started small. When I mentioned, casually, that I had a date after work, Ethan froze for exactly 2 seconds before saying, with who? Jason. Jason who? I blinked. Why do you care? I don't, he said immediately. I'm simply verifying his credentials. His credentials? Yes. As a person. I stared at him. Right. Well, he's a teacher, he's nice, and he's taking me to dinner. That's all you need to know. Ethan's jaw clenched. It was weird, but I chalked it up to his usual brand of I dislike human interactions, and this conversation is making me uncomfortable. I was so wrong. The date was going fine, until Jason, completely serious, leaned forward and asked, "So, how do you feel about the flat earth theory?" I choked on my drink. What? He nodded solemnly. The government's been lying to us, Josie. I have proof. I barely made it through dinner without running out of the restaurant. When I got to work the next day, Ethan was smug. "Date didn't go well?" he asked, not even trying to hide his satisfaction. I narrowed my eyes. "How did you know that?" He shrugged. "Call it intuition. I should have caught on then, but I didn't." So, like an idiot, I agreed to another setup. This time, the guy showed up in a full suit of armor. Like, actual medieval armor. I had to sit through an entire meal listening to Sir Weirdo explain his strict code of chivalry, all while clanking every time he moved. When I walked into Ethan's office the next morning, still vaguely traumatized, he was practically glowing. "Another bad date?" he asked innocently. I squinted at him. "Ethan." "Yes. You wouldn't happen to know anything about why my last 2 dates were absolute disasters, would you?" He looked offended. "Josie, I am a busy man. I don't have time to meddle in your personal life." I crossed my arms. "Right. Just checking." But I was watching him now. And when my 3rd date ended up being an unemployed magician who made my fork disappear mid-dinner, I knew Ethan Sterling was sabotaging me. The next morning, I stormed into his office, slammed my hands on his desk, and glared at him. "You're ruining my dates." Ethan, completely unbothered, leaned back in his chair. "Your taste in men is ruining your dates." I groaned. "Ethan." He exhaled, long-suffering. "Josie, let's be honest. None of these men were suitable for you." I threw up my hands. "Like WHO, Ethan?" Silence. Thick. Heavy. Charged. He stared at me. I stared back. And then, very quietly, he said, "You're the only person I can touch." The air between us shifted. My breath caught. His gaze, usually so composed, was bare, raw, vulnerable, and just like that, everything changed. Chapter 6. The grand gesture. I had no words. Ethan Sterling, the untouchable, emotionally constipated, human icicle, had just admitted, out loud, that I was the only person he could touch. The weight of that statement settled between us, thick and impossible to ignore. For the first time since I met him, Ethan wasn't hiding behind his usual detached logic. He wasn't pretending this was just another puzzle to solve. No, this was raw, real, and I had absolutely no idea what to do with it. I tried to move past it, tried being the key word, but something was different. It was in the way he looked at me, like I had flipped his entire world upside down, and he was still scrambling to make sense of it. And then came the touching. Not a lot, just tiny, fleeting moments, things he never would have done before. The first time, I almost didn't catch it. A brush of fingers against my wrist as he handed me a folder. A light touch on my lower back as he guided me through a crowded hallway. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was reading into it too much. But then I noticed the way he braced himself before doing it, like he was training himself to tolerate contact. And that's when I knew Ethan Sterling was trying. Trying for me. It all led up to the grand gesture. I walked into my office one morning, and nearly screamed. Sitting on my desk, in all its ridiculous, life-sized glory, was a giant pillow. Shaped like Ethan, complete with a tiny suit and his signature scowl printed on the fabric. I burst out laughing. "Ethan, what the hell is this?" He stood in the doorway, looking far too pleased with himself. "You sleep better with something to hold." I gaped at him. "So your solution was to buy me a pillow version of yourself?" He smirked. It seemed logical. I shook my head, half in disbelief, half in pure affection for this ridiculous, impossible man. "You're a ridiculous man? And yet," he murmured, stepping closer, "you still work for me." I let out a soft laugh, my heart hammering. "Not for long." His smirk vanished. His entire body tensed. What? I could see it. The way his mind raced, the way he panicked at the thought of me leaving. Before he could spiral, I grabbed his face, pulled him down, and kissed him senseless. For a brief moment, he froze. And then, he melted. His hands gripped my waist, his lips moving against mine like he was making up for years of lost time. And just like that, the untouchable man finally let himself be touched.
Epilogue. Happily ever after. with shenanigans. Falling in love with Josie Miller was not part of my plan. Then again, neither was allowing another human being to touch me. Yet here I was, Ethan Sterling, once the most untouchable man in existence, now sitting at my desk with Josie curled up in my lap like it was the most natural thing in the world. It had started small. A brush of her hand, the press of her shoulder against mine. At first, I had convinced myself that I was merely tolerating it, that my body was adapting to her presence. But I wasn't adapting. I was craving. I wanted more. And now I had her. Which was how I found myself in this position, one arm wrapped firmly around her waist, my other hand idly tracing circles against her back, when my assistant, Oliver, walked into my office and froze. His eyes darted between me and Josie, his entire face contorted in disbelief. "Sir, are you hugging?" I scowled. "I allow one person to touch me, Oliver. Don't make a big deal out of it." Josie, ever the troublemaker, smirked against my chest. "He's even initiating sometimes?" Oliver let out a choked sound, took 2 unsteady steps backward. "And then he fainted." I sighed. "Dramatic?" Josie giggled. "You did just break his brain," I hummed, pressing my lips to her temple. "Then he should toughen up. Because this was my new normal. And I had no intention of letting it go." Later that night, long after Josie had moved in, I woke up to the familiar warmth of her body curled against mine. I exhaled slowly, the kind of deep, contented sigh I never used to allow myself. For years, I had lived with an unbearable, restless tension in my body, a constant hum of discomfort that never truly disappeared. I had trained myself to endure it, convinced that it was simply part of who I was. But Josie changed everything. With her, the tension faded, the static in my mind quieted. She was my personal storm, loud, unpredictable, relentless, and yet, somehow, she had become the only place where I felt calm. As I watched her sleep, she shifted, her hand lifting to pat my face in a lazy, absent-minded motion. She mumbled, "Half asleep. Pillow time." I grinned, because of course, she would say something utterly ridiculous in her sleep. I pressed a slow, lingering kiss to the top of her head, letting my lips linger against her hair. "Fine," I murmured against her skin. "But only because it's you." And for the first time in my life, I didn't mind being held. I wanted it. Because in the end, Josie wasn't just the exception. She was everything.